A waitress pays a ragged boy to beg in a restaurant, earning the restaurant owner's scorn. Little does she know that after just one free meal, her life will change from here. The neon sign buzzed softly, its flickering glow washing the sidewalk in patches of red and blue. Outside, rain drizzled onto the pavement, collecting in shallow puddles that reflected the streetlights. The smell of fried food and burnt coffee clung to the air, mingling with the low hum of late-night chatter. Inside, Stars and Stripes Burger, the atmosphere was the same as any other evening. Booths filled with tired truckers nursing lukewarm coffee, teenagers giggling over baskets of fries, and families wrapping up their meals, ushering sleepy children into coats. Pamela wiped the counter for what felt like the 100th time, her fingers gripping the damp rag with absent-minded pressure. Her back ached, her shoes pinched, and the thought of her overdue rent lurked in the back of her mind like an unwelcome guest. Still, she forced a smile when a customer approached, her voice carrying the same practiced warmth she had mastered over the years. "Refill on that coffee, Mr. Jenkins?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. The elderly man nodded, his wrinkled fingers tapping the counter in thanks. "You're a good one, Pam," he muttered, his voice scratchy from years of smoking. "Not like that vulture over there." His eyes flicked toward Michelle, who stood near the register, arms crossed, eyes sharp. Pamela didn't respond. She had learned long ago that nothing good came from agreeing or disagreeing when it came to Michelle. The bell above the door jingled, and Pamela instinctively glanced up. A small figure hesitated at the entrance, shoulders hunched against the cold. His clothes, too thin for the weather, clung to his small frame, damp from the drizzle outside. His shoes, if they could even be called that, were torn at the edges, and his fingers curled tightly into his sleeves as if trying to hide from the world. For a moment, he didn't move. The warmth of the restaurant must have been a shock after the biting wind outside. Pamela's chest tightened. Then Michelle noticed him, her lips pursed, her eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. "Great," she muttered, just loud enough for Pamela to hear. "Another stray." Pamela ignored her. The boy stepped forward cautiously, his gaze flicking between the bright menu board and the customers who were beginning to notice him. A few exchanged wary glances. One woman clutched her purse a little closer. A group of teenagers snickered, whispering to each other. Pamela swallowed against the familiar ache in her throat. Finally, the boy reached the counter, his small hands gripping the edge as if steadying himself. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "Can I have, just a piece of bread?" He hesitated, then quickly added, "It doesn't need anything in it." Pamela stilled. She had served all kinds of people, rushed businessmen, truck drivers who left her generous tips, college kids with empty wallets. But there was something about the way this boy wouldn't meet her eyes, the way his fingers twitched slightly against the counter, that made her heart lurch. "Just bread?" she asked, keeping her tone light. He nodded as if afraid to want more. Behind her, Michelle scoffed. "Oh, for God's sake," she said. "Pamela, don't encourage this. He stinks. Get him out before customers start complaining." Pamela saw the way the boy flinched at her words, his fingers tightening on the counter. A hot surge of anger burned in her chest. Without a word, she turned, grabbed a sandwich from the warmer, and rang it up. Then she poured a small carton of milk and slid both items toward him. "Here you go, sweetheart," she said softly. The boy's eyes widened. "But Pamela tapped her name tag. "How special," she said with a wink, "for a friend of mine." He hesitated, as if waiting for her to take it back. Then, with careful hands, he picked up the sandwich and the milk, clutching them as if they might vanish. "Thank you," he murmured. Before Pamela could respond, Michelle yanked her arm and dragged her away from the counter. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" she hissed. "This isn't a shelter. You're giving free food to some filthy street kid while paying customers are watching." Pamela pulled her arm free, glaring. "I paid for it." Michelle let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Oh well, aren't you generous? But I'm docking your pay for this shift. Maybe next time you'll think twice before throwing money at strays." Pamela's fists clenched, but she said nothing. It wasn't fair, but neither was life. She glanced over her shoulder just in time to see the boy slipping into a corner booth, his small frame curling inward as he ate, slowly, deliberately, savoring each bite as if memorizing the taste. She sighed. After a moment, she walked back to the counter. "Hey," she called softly. The boy looked up, startled. "What's your name?" she asked. For a long moment, he just stared at her, as if deciding whether or not to trust her with such a thing. Then, finally, in the quietest voice imaginable, he whispered, "Donald." Pamela smiled. "Nice to meet you, Donald." The boy didn't respond, just nodded once quickly before returning to his meal. Pamela didn't press. She simply stood there, watching as he ate, her heart heavier than before. When Donald finally left, she caught a glimpse of him pausing at the door, looking back at her. His eyes flickered down to her name tag, his lips pressing together as if committing it to memory. And then, just like that, he was gone. Pamela stood there for a long time, staring at the empty booth. Somewhere in the distance, the neon sign outside flickered again, the rain tapping lightly against the glass. And in the corner of her mind, the weight of that boy's quiet desperation settled in. The street was quiet, except for the occasional hiss of a passing car, its tires gliding over rain-slicked pavement. Neon signs blinked in rhythmic exhaustion, casting their tired glow onto sidewalks, damp with the evening drizzle. A man in a suit hurried past, clutching a to-go coffee, his footsteps brisk, purposeful. Across the street, laughter spilled from the open door of a small Italian restaurant where families leaned into each other over steaming plates of pasta. Pamela walked with her hands shoved into the pockets of her thin jacket, her steps slow, her body tense against the cold. The damp air seeped through the fabric, biting at her skin, but she hardly noticed. Her mind was elsewhere, back at the diner, back to the moment she had slid the sandwich and milk across the counter, back to him. Donald. She could still see the way his fingers curled around the carton, how his small shoulders had hunched forward as if bracing for someone to snatch the food away, the way he ate, not greedily, not carelessly, but deliberately, as if each bite had to last. Pamela exhaled, the sound barely audible over the murmur of the city. Where was he now? Did he have somewhere warm to sleep? Was he safe? A gust of wind rushed through the street, rattling the loose metal sign of a laundromat. She pulled her jacket tighter, as if the thin fabric could somehow shield her from more than just the cold. She turned the corner onto her block. Unlike the lively streets she had just passed, this one was quiet, lined with darkened storefronts and old apartment buildings with iron fire escapes. The Stars and Stripes burger was still visible in the distance, its fluorescent sign flickering like an afterthought. Pamela hesitated for just a second, then forced herself to keep walking. Her building was as unremarkable as ever, a 3-story walk-up with chipped brick and a door that stuck in the winter. She pushed inside, climbing the narrow staircase with sluggish steps, the smell of fried food from downstairs lingering in the hall. When she unlocked the door, the dim glow from the street lamp outside was the only thing illuminating her studio apartment. She didn't bother turning on the light just yet. The space was small, just a bed against the wall, a tiny kitchenette with an old stove, and a second-hand couch that had seen better days. On the counter, a stack of unopened envelopes sat untouched, their presence heavy in the room. Pamela ignored them. She tossed her bag onto the couch, then leaned against the counter, rubbing her temples. Her body ached from the long shift, but it wasn't just exhaustion pressing down on her. It was everything: the weight of too many months barely making rent, the endless cycle of work and worry, the growing frustration with the world's quiet cruelty. And Michelle's voice, still sharp in her ears: "We don't do charity here." Pamela clenched her fists. The worst part wasn't that Michelle had taken money from her paycheck. It wasn't even the humiliation of being scolded in front of customers. It was the ease with which she had dismissed Donald. The way she had looked at a hungry child and seen nothing but an inconvenience. Pamela grabbed a glass from the sink, filling it with water from the tap. She took a sip, her throat tight. Her phone buzzed on the counter. For a second, she debated ignoring it, but when she glanced at the screen, a familiar name flashed across. Lillian. Her sister. Pamela let out a slow breath before answering. "Hey, Lil," she said, forcing some lightness into her tone. "Pam, finally, you pick up. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about me." Pamela smiled faintly. "Never." There was a pause, then the sound of Lillian shifting, maybe settling onto her couch. "How's work? You sound tired." "It's fine," Pamela said automatically. "Same as always." A beat of silence. "You sure?" Pamela glanced at the unopened bills, then looked away. "Yeah," she said. "Just a long shift." Lillian sighed. "I keep telling you, if things get too rough, you can come stay with me for a while. I know it's not ideal, but I'm fine, Lil." "Pam." Pamela squeezed her eyes shut. Her sister had always been the responsible one, the planner, the fixer. The one who had managed to build a stable life while Pamela was still scraping by, shift to shift, paycheck to paycheck. And while Lillian's offer was genuine, Pamela couldn't accept it, not because of pride, but because it wasn't a solution. It was just a pause on a problem that would still be waiting for her the moment she left. So she swallowed back the lump in her throat and said, "I appreciate it, really, but I'm okay." Another pause. Lillian didn't believe her, but she didn't push. Instead, she said, "You're still coming for Thanksgiving, right?" Pamela hesitated. Thanksgiving. 2 weeks away. She should go. She wanted to. But the thought of sitting at a dinner table, surrounded by warmth and good food, pretending everything was fine, felt unbearable. "I'll try," she said. Lillian sighed again, softer this time. "All right. Just take care of yourself, okay?" "I will." They said their goodbyes, and when Pamela hung up, the silence in the apartment felt louder than before. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. Her mind drifted back to Donald, to the way he had hesitated before saying his name, to the way he had clutched his food as if it might disappear. She wondered if he had someone checking in on him tonight, and the weight of that thought settled deep in her chest. Pamela lay down, pulling the thin blanket over herself. Outside, the city carried on, car horns in the distance, laughter spilling from a late-night bar, footsteps echoing down the alley. Life continued, indifferent as ever. And somewhere out there, a little boy was navigating that world alone. Pamela stared at the ceiling. She had done something good today, but why didn't it feel like enough? The days folded into each other, indistinguishable in their repetition. The morning rush, the lunch crowd, the dull hum of conversation mixed with the clatter of trays and the sizzle of oil. Pamela fell into the rhythm of work, her hands moving without thought, her smile automatic, her replies to customers well rehearsed. It had been a month. Donald never came back. At first, she found herself glancing toward the door each shift, expecting to see that small figure hesitate at the entrance again. But as the weeks passed, the habit faded. The world didn't wait for sentimentality. Rent was still due. Groceries still needed to be bought. The exhaustion that clung to her never let up. And yet, despite everything, she never stopped wondering. Where had he gone? Was he safe? Did someone find him? Help him? Or had he simply slipped between the cracks, another story left unfinished? She never asked out loud. Not to Michelle, not to her co-workers, and certainly not to herself in the quiet hours of the night when she lay staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Pamela kept her head down, worked the extra shifts when she could, and ignored the snide remarks from Michelle. "You're too soft, Pamela," Michelle said one afternoon as she counted the register, her tone thick with amusement. "You think helping people makes a difference. All it does is put you behind. People like that take advantage of people like you." Pamela didn't argue. Not anymore. Instead, she wiped down the counter, watching a young mother struggle to calm her toddler at a booth near the window. A tired-looking man dropped a few coins onto the counter, his face worn but polite, as he ordered a black coffee. Nothing more. She didn't see what Michelle saw. Pamela had never understood how people could dismiss struggle just because it wasn't their own. But she couldn't change the way Michelle thought, just like she couldn't change the fact that Donald was gone. So she worked. And when she had time, she scrolled through job listings, her fingers hovering over positions that required qualifications she didn't have. Office assistant, data entry, receptionist. She could type. She could organize things. But every time she reached the part about experience, she hesitated. She had spent years taking orders and refilling coffee cups. What did that count for? She shut the laptop one evening and exhaled, resting her forehead against her hand. Maybe Michelle was right. Maybe some people just stayed stuck. It was a slow evening, the kind where the hours dragged and the customers trickled in at odd intervals, leaving the place eerily quiet. Pamela was restocking napkins near the counter when the click of expensive heels against the tiled floor caught her attention. The woman who stepped inside didn't belong here. Everything about her, her cashmere coat, the way she scanned the menu with mild disinterest, the way she kept her handbag close, suggested that she had walked into Stars and Stripes Burger by mistake. Pamela straightened. "Good evening. Can I help you?" The woman barely glanced up. "I was just—" She hesitated, her gaze flickering across the menu before she shook her head. "Never mind." She turned on her heel and walked out. Pamela blinked, watching the door swing shut behind her. It wasn't unusual for people to walk in and leave, especially if they had expected something fancier. But something about the encounter felt odd, though she couldn't quite place why. The woman had lingered, her eyes darting around as if she had expected to see someone. Pamela shrugged it off and returned to work. She didn't know that the woman was Catherine Grant, and she didn't know that, in another world, their paths were about to cross in ways she could never have imagined. Later that night, as Pamela walked home, the city felt colder than usual. She passed the same streets, the same neon signs, and the same shuttered storefronts. The laughter from a distant bar carried through the wind, mixing with the faint honking of cars on the main road. She pulled her jacket closer, but the chill wasn't just from the air. She wasn't sure when she had stopped looking for him, or when she had started to accept that she never would. But as she turned the corner onto her block, the flickering glow of the diner's neon sign caught her eye. And for just a second, she thought she saw a small figure standing in the doorway, watching. Her breath hitched. She blinked. The doorway was empty. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head at herself. Donald was gone, and Pamela was tired of waiting for ghosts. She climbed the stairs to her apartment and closed the door behind her. Another night, another day is waiting ahead, and an unfinished story that refused to let her go. The morning rush came and went, leaving behind the lingering scent of coffee and grilled patties. Pamela worked through the day in the steady rhythm she had come to rely on, taking orders, refilling drinks, wiping tables clean. It was easier to focus on the next task, the next movement, than to let her mind drift to the things she could not change. She had stopped searching for familiar faces in the crowd. She had stopped expecting to see him. Outside, the sun began its slow descent behind the skyline, casting a golden hue over the city. Pamela balanced a tray of food in her hands, weaving through the crowded diner. The usual mix of customers filled the space, families grabbing dinner, teens scrolling through their phones, and a few construction workers nursing their burgers with quiet exhaustion. It was just another day at Stars and Stripes Burger, until the hush fell. It started as a murmur, a ripple of shifting bodies, heads turning toward the large glass window that overlooked the street. Then the whispers grew, stretching across the restaurant in hushed voices. Someone dropped a fork. Another nudged their companion. Pamela frowned as she turned toward the window. A sleek, black Rolls-Royce had pulled up to the curb. The kind of car that didn't belong in this part of town, let alone in front of a fast food joint. The doors opened. First, a tall man in a tailored suit stepped out. Then, a woman, elegant and poised, wrapped in a coat that looked more expensive than the diner's monthly rent. And between them, Pamela's breath caught. Donald. She froze, the tray suddenly too heavy in her hands. He wasn't the small, shivering boy she had last seen, huddled in a booth, clutching a carton of milk. No. This Donald was different, clean, well-dressed. His hair was neatly combed, and his posture was upright, but hesitant. Her fingers loosened, just for a second. The tray tilted. A clatter rang through the diner as the plates crashed to the floor, food splattering across the tiles. Gasps and muttered exclamations followed, all eyes snapping towards her. And then, Michelle. "What the hell, Pamela?" Pamela barely had time to react before Michelle stormed toward her, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. "You think we just give away food around here?" She snapped, her voice rising with every word. "First you pulled that stunt last month, and now you're throwing food on the floor. Are you trying to cost us money?" Pamela couldn't move. Her breath felt lodged in her throat, her body refusing to react to Michelle's words, to the stunned silence of the crowd, to the murmuring customers. Because Donald was looking at her. And he remembered. Before Pamela could even open her mouth to respond, another voice cut through the tension, sharp, unwavering. "Enough." The entire room stilled. Michelle turned towards the source of the voice, her mouth still open mid-rant, only to find herself face-to-face with Catherine Grant. The woman's presence commanded the room in an instant. Her expression was unreadable, but her gaze was firm, sharp enough to silence even Michelle. "I beg your pardon," Michelle scoffed, though her voice had lost some of its usual venom. Catherine didn't flinch. "You've humiliated your employee enough for one day." Pamela blinked, struggling to process what was happening. Michelle straightened, clearly thrown by the sudden challenge. "I don't see how this is any of your business," she said, forcing a tight smile. "This is an internal matter." Catherine's lips curved, though there was no warmth behind it. "Oh, I think it is," she said smoothly. And then Donald moved. In a blur of motion, he pulled free from his father's grasp and ran straight to Pamela. "Pamela!" The entire restaurant watched in stunned silence as he threw his arms around her, his small frame pressing into her side. His grip was tight, as if he was afraid she might disappear. Pamela felt the world tilt. "Donald," she breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. He pulled back just enough to look up at her. His eyes shone with something unspoken, something he couldn't quite say, but didn't need to. His parents stepped forward then, and Pamela found herself face to face with Christian Grant. Unlike his wife, Christian's expression was softer, but there was weight behind his gaze, a quiet authority, the kind of presence that filled a room without effort. "You're Pamela," he said, not a question, but a confirmation. Pamela swallowed, nodding. Catherine's eyes softened just slightly as she looked at her son, still clinging to Pamela's side. "He hasn't stopped talking about you," she said. Pamela's lips parted, but she didn't know what to say. The entire restaurant was watching, the tension thick, the moment impossibly surreal. And Michelle, well, Michelle looked like she might faint from confusion. Pamela, still reeling, could only stare at Donald, feeling the weight of a month's worth of unanswered questions collide all at once. He was here. He was safe. But why had he come back? And what did this mean for her? The restaurant felt too still, the weight of anticipation pressing against the walls. Pamela's heart pounded in her chest, her hands still faintly shaking from the shock of it all. Donald. He was here. Safe. And yet, this moment, this surreal collision of two worlds, felt like something out of a dream, a fragile thing that might vanish if she moved too suddenly. Christian Grant, the man who had spoken her name with quiet certainty, stepped forward, his measured presence filling the space. He glanced around the room, taking in the sea of curious faces, the way Michelle was still standing rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line. He exhaled, then spoke in a voice that was neither loud nor rushed, yet somehow commanded absolute silence. "I'm closing the restaurant for the rest of the day." The words hung in the air, sinking into the stunned hush. A flicker of disbelief crossed Michelle's face, her gaze darting between Christian and Catherine, as if waiting for a punchline. "Excuse me?" she scoffed, attempting to recover. "You can't just—" Christian turned to her, expression unreadable. "Consider it compensated. I'll pay whatever you would have made today, and then some." His tone was polite, almost detached, but there was no room for negotiation. Pamela saw the way Michelle hesitated. It wasn't often that money outweighed her pride, but when it did, she knew when to fold. She crossed her arms, her expression twisting as she let out a sharp exhale. "Fine," she bit out, "but don't expect me to clean up this mess." Pamela barely heard her, because Donald was still holding her hand. And then, with a burst of energy, he grinned, the kind of pure, unguarded joy she had never seen in him before. "She's the one," he announced excitedly, his voice rising above the murmurs of the remaining customers. "She's the one who helped me." Pamela sank to her knees, instinctively meeting him at eye level. He was so different now, his cheeks no longer hollow, his clothes neat and warm. But his eyes, they were the same. Still searching, still remembering. "Donald," she said softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." "You helped me," he repeated, his grip on her tightening, as if making sure she wouldn't disappear. A lump formed in her throat. Christian watched the exchange with quiet understanding before finally breaking the silence. "I believe you deserve an explanation," he said. Pamela rose slowly, though Donald still didn't let go. She nodded. "Please." Christian gestured toward a booth, his presence stilling the room in a way Pamela had never seen before. The other customers had begun to filter out, some lingering near the door, unwilling to leave before hearing what this was all about. Catherine sat first, her movements elegant but purposeful, while Christian settled beside her. Pamela hesitated before sliding in across from them, her fingers still curled around Donald's smaller ones. The table between them felt like a fragile bridge. Christian leaned forward slightly, elbows resting against the edge. He was the kind of man who measured his words, each one deliberate. "Donald was taken," he said finally, his voice even. But Pamela caught the slight edge beneath it, the restraint, the controlled anger. "About 6 weeks ago." The breath left her lungs, Kidnapped. Her gaze snapped to Donald, but the boy was staring at his father now, his expression serious, the excitement from earlier now tempered by memory. Catherine took over then, her voice softer but no less steady. "It was a targeted abduction," she said, glancing at Christian before turning back to Pamela. "Business rivals of Christian's saw an opportunity, a way to manipulate, to gain leverage." Pamela felt sick. Christian exhaled, his fingers lacing together. "But they underestimated our son." Pamela's eyes flickered back to Donald, and for the first time, she saw it. Not just the child before her, but the weight of what he had endured. Donald nodded firmly, his little chin lifting. "I ran away," he said, and there was no fear in his voice, only determination. "I got out." Pamela couldn't speak. The boy who had stood before her in tattered clothes, exhausted but still holding on, he had escaped. "And you were the first kind face he saw," Christian finished. A long silence stretched between them. Pamela swallowed past the tightness in her throat, shaking her head slightly. "I didn't do anything special," she murmured. Catherine's eyes softened. "You fed our son when he had nothing," she said. "That's more than special, Pamela." Donald pressed his cheek against her arm. "I didn't know if I'd ever see you again," he admitted quietly. Pamela squeezed his hand. "Neither did I." And then, for the first time in a long time, she felt something loosen inside her, something that had been knotted tight ever since that night when he had walked away, disappearing into the city. He had found his way back. He had made it. The quiet moment was broken by the sound of Michelle's exasperated sigh. "So what?" she scoffed, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "She gave a kid a sandwich. Big deal." Catherine's gaze flicked toward her, sharp and assessing. Christian, however, barely reacted. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a sleek black card, and slid it onto the table. "I'm buying the diner," he said, not looking at Michelle as he spoke. Silence. A thick, unyielding silence that swallowed the room whole. Pamela's eyes snapped up, her breath caught somewhere between shock and disbelief. Michelle's jaw dropped. "You," she sputtered, "you can't be serious." Christian's expression didn't waver. "I assure you, I am." Pamela could see the calculations running through Michelle's mind, the fight between pride and profit, the realization that she was standing before a man who did not make empty threats. And just like that, Michelle backed down. She didn't apologize. That wasn't in her nature. But Pamela saw it, the way her frustration twisted into something uglier, the way she clenched her jaw as she turned on her heel and stalked toward the kitchen, effectively removing herself from the conversation. Catherine exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "Charming woman," she murmured. Pamela let out a breathless laugh, but it didn't quite feel real yet. She turned back to Christian. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. He met her gaze, and there was no hesitation. "Neither did you," he replied. Pamela's fingers curled around the edge of the table, the enormity of it all settling in. This wasn't just about a meal anymore. It never had been. The weight of Christian's words hung heavy in the air, pressing down on Pamela as if the very walls of the diner had shifted. She could still hear Michelle's retreating footsteps, but her mind was barely processing them. He was buying the diner. For a moment, Pamela thought she'd misheard him. The restaurant still felt too still, the usual background noise, clinking silverware, the hum of the fryer, the low murmur of conversation, muted beneath the unbelievable reality of the moment. You can't just buy a place like this," she finally managed, her voice quiet, almost uncertain. Christian didn't blink. "I assure you I can." Beside him, Catherine exhaled lightly, as if amused by Pamela's disbelief. "He's not the type to make empty gestures, dear," she said, adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. "And I imagine the owner will be more than happy to sell once the price is right." Pamela swallowed, her fingers still curled around the edge of the table. This was too much. "You don't have to do this," she said, forcing herself to meet Christian's gaze. "I don't need some grand reward just because I gave Donald a meal." The words felt too raw, too exposed, but she had to say them. Christian studied her for a long moment, the faintest hint of something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "You think this is about repayment?" he asked. Pamela hesitated. "Wasn't it?" Before she could respond, he shook his head, almost as if reading her thoughts. "No, Pamela. This isn't about charity or gratitude. It's about recognizing the kind of person you are." She stiffened. "You didn't hesitate," Christian continued, his voice measured, calm. "You saw someone in need, and you acted. Not because it benefited you, not because someone was watching, but because it was simply the right thing to do." Pamela felt Donald's small fingers wrap tighter around hers, grounding her. Christian's eyes didn't waver. "People like that are rare," he said simply. Pamela opened her mouth to argue. But what could she say? That she wasn't special, that she had only done what anyone should have done. She wasn't sure Christian would accept that answer. Then he exhaled softly, glancing toward Catherine before turning back to her. "You work hard, Pamela," he said. "I've looked into your background." Her breath hitched. "You... what?" "I needed to know more about the person who helped my son," Christian said, unbothered by her reaction. "And what I found was exactly what I expected. You're resilient, dedicated, but you're also stuck." Pamela stiffened. You've been working here for how long?" he continued. She hesitated. 4 years. "And in that time, have you ever been given a raise? A promotion?" Pamela's stomach twisted. She knew the answer, but the way Christian posed the question, so matter-of-fact, so direct, made it feel different, more damning. "No," she admitted. Christian nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "You've been working a dead-end job under a boss who doesn't appreciate you," he said, "all while barely making enough to get by. And yet, you still put others before yourself." Pamela felt exposed, as if someone had turned her inside out, revealing every quiet struggle she had tried to push down, to ignore. She looked away. "You don't belong here, Pamela." The words made her chest tighten. "Then where do I belong?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Christian didn't hesitate. "At my company." Pamela's head snapped up. Catherine smiled slightly, as if she had been expecting this. Pamela, on the other hand, was struggling to breathe properly. I don't have the experience for something like that," she stammered. "You have exactly what I need," Christian countered. "Work ethic, integrity, the ability to think beyond yourself. Skills can be taught. Character cannot." Pamela felt lightheaded. A job, a real job, not one that left her on her feet for 10-hour shifts, not one that barely covered rent, not one where she had to listen to Michelle's cutting remarks and pretend they didn't sting. It was stability, a future, and it terrified her. I don't know," she said finally, her voice unsteady. "I don't fit into your world. I serve burgers, Christian. I don't belong in some high-rise office." A beat of silence, then a tug on her hand. Pamela looked down. Donald's gaze was pleading, unwavering. "Please say yes," he whispered. Pamela felt her heart break a little. She was afraid. She had been afraid for so long, of change, of failing, of proving that she wasn't enough. But Donald believed in her. And Christian, he was offering her something no one ever had before, a chance. She exhaled slowly. Then, hesitantly, she extended her hand. Christian took it without hesitation, his grip steady, certain. "Welcome aboard, Pamela." She barely heard Catherine's approving murmur, barely noticed the subtle smile that played on Christian's lips. All she could feel was the weight of everything she had ever known shifting beneath her feet. She had just stepped into something entirely new, and she wasn't sure whether to be terrified or hopeful. Maybe both. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet chime, revealing a corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that bathed the space in soft morning light. The view stretched across the skyline, a dizzying contrast to the streets Pamela had walked for years. She stepped forward hesitantly, adjusting the strap of her purse, her shoes clicking against the polished marble floor. Everything around her gleamed: glass partitions, sleek desks, quiet efficiency humming through the air like a well-rehearsed symphony. It was nothing like Stars and Stripes Burger. She felt out of place. The receptionist, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and an air of quiet confidence, barely glanced up from her screen. "Name?" Pamela swallowed. "Pamela Carter." The woman typed something, then nodded toward a side hallway. "Second door on the left. Mrs. Grant is expecting you." Pamela exhaled slowly, willing herself forward. The office Catherine led her to was smaller than she expected, but no less intimidating. A modern desk sat in the center, flanked by neatly arranged bookshelves and a window overlooking the city. Catherine gestured for her to sit. "How are you feeling?" Pamela hesitated. Was there a right answer to that? She settled for honesty. "Overwhelmed." Catherine smiled, not unkindly. "Good. That means you care." Pamela nodded, her hands tightening in her lap. I don't want to mess this up." "You won't." Catherine folded her hands atop the desk. "I'll be here to guide you. You're not alone in this." The words should have reassured her. Instead, Pamela's stomach churned, because the truth was, she had always been alone in this. Her whole life, she had fought her own battles, made her own way. The idea of someone helping her felt foreign. Catherine seemed to sense the hesitation. "There will be people here who doubt you," she continued. "People who will wonder how someone with your background ended up in this position." Pamela looked up sharply. Catherine smiled slightly. "Let them wonder, then prove them wrong." As the day unfolded, Pamela quickly realized that this world was built differently. The pace was fast. Conversations snapped through the air like electric currents. People moved with purpose, their tasks laid out in seamless efficiency. And then there was her. She felt the glances the moment she stepped into the main office space. Quiet assessments, the slight lift of brows, the exchanged whispers. "Is she a new hire? Thought she was just some assistant. I heard she used to work in a—" The sentence dropped off as the woman speaking noticed Pamela's presence. Pamela pretended not to hear. She focused on her desk, her own desk, a far cry from the greasy counters she had once wiped down. A computer instead of a cash register, a chair with a backrest instead of a metal stool. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, she felt like an imposter. Catherine kept her close for the first few days, walking her through procedures, introducing her to key figures, gently correcting her when needed. Pamela had never typed so much in her life. She had never scheduled meetings, organized reports, drafted emails that had to sound professional. She stumbled, more than once. She forgot names. She sent an email to the wrong department. She panicked when a phone call wasn't scripted, when there wasn't a pre-made response like there had been at the diner. But she also learned. She adapted, absorbed information like a sponge, stayed late reading files, watching how others handled themselves. She was out of her depth. But she was swimming anyway. Not everyone welcomed her. Some colleagues were polite, but distant, their smiles thin, their questions laced with unspoken judgment. Others were outright dismissive. One afternoon, Pamela overheard a conversation near the break room. She's not qualified. Connections, probably. The Grants must have taken pity on her. She won't last a month. Pamela didn't confront them. She didn't need to. Because later that day, Catherine placed a hand on her shoulder and leaned in just enough to be heard. "Let them talk," she murmured, "and then show them exactly why they were wrong." Pamela nodded. She wasn't here to prove anything to them. She was here to prove it to herself. The first small victory. At the end of the week, Pamela found herself staying late, going over reports she barely understood. A senior assistant, Monica, one of the few who had been friendly, noticed. "You're still here?" Pamela glanced up, rubbing the back of her neck. "Just, trying to catch up." Monica studied her for a moment. Then, with a sigh, she pulled out a chair. "All right," she said. "Let me help you." Pamela blinked. "You don't have to." "I know." Monica smirked. "But let's be real. You're not leaving until you figure this out, are you?" Pamela laughed softly. "Probably not." Monica slid a report toward her. "Okay then, let's start with the basics." For the first time all week, Pamela felt a little less alone. She wasn't perfect. She had a long way to go. But as she left the office that night, stepping into the crisp evening air, she realized something important. She had walked away from a world she had known for years, the safety of routine, the familiarity of struggle, and stepped into the unknown. And maybe, just maybe, she belonged here after all. The days began to settle into a rhythm, though nothing about Pamela's new life felt settled. Each morning, she navigated the polished halls of the company, feeling like a misplaced puzzle piece, trying to find where she fit. Yet, there was one constant. Donald. It started small. A knock at her office door, hesitant but familiar. Pamela looked up from her screen to find a small figure peeking in. "Busy?" A grin tugged at her lips. "Not too busy for you." Donald beamed and slipped inside, climbing onto the chair across from her desk. In his hands, he clutched a folded piece of paper. "I drew this," he said proudly, pushing it toward her. Pamela unfolded it carefully. It was a crayon drawing, messy lines, bright colors, a stick figure version of herself standing next to Donald, a big yellow sun overhead. Her chest tightened unexpectedly. "It's perfect," she murmured. "You're a great artist, you know that." Donald puffed up. "I practice." From that day on, he visited often, sometimes after school, sometimes during lunch breaks, when Catherine wasn't too busy to bring him by. He would sit on her couch, munching on snacks, chatting about his day with the unfiltered enthusiasm only a child could have. Pamela found herself waiting for those visits, the moments of brightness they brought. He told her about soccer practice, about the new friend he made in class, about how his teacher said he talked too much. But she's wrong because talking is important, right, Pamela? She listened. She always listened. And as time passed, something shifted in her. A quiet understanding that her purpose here wasn't just about learning reports or handling emails. It was about something bigger. One afternoon, Catherine walked into Pamela's office, catching sight of the latest drawing Donald had left on her desk. "You've made quite an impression on him," she said, amusement in her tone. Pamela smiled. "I think it's the other way around." Catherine studied her for a moment, then leaned against the desk. "Have you ever considered getting involved in the company's philanthropy division?" Pamela blinked. "Me?" Catherine nodded. "We have several charity initiatives, outreach programs for single mothers, funding for community centers, partnerships with shelters. You'd be a natural at it." Pamela hesitated. I I wouldn't even know where to start." Catherine waved a hand. "You start by showing up. The rest you'll figure out." And just like that, Pamela found herself attending her first charity event. It was a fundraiser for underprivileged children, an evening gala, the kind of affair Pamela had only ever seen from the outside, watching through restaurant windows as well-dressed people clinked glasses and made polite conversation. She stood at the edge of the room, adjusting the borrowed dress Catherine had insisted she wear, feeling out of place. Then she saw the children. Some were from shelters, others from struggling families, their eyes wide as they took in the glittering lights, the extravagant displays. Pamela understood that look, that feeling of stepping into a world you didn't belong in. So she did what no one else seemed to be doing. She sat with them, talked to them, asked them about their favorite cartoons and their favorite foods. And slowly, their hesitation faded. She wasn't a wealthy donor in a ball gown. She was someone who understood, and that mattered. The weeks passed and Pamela threw herself into the work. She helped organize food drives, visited shelters, and attended board meetings discussing real issues. For the first time, she felt like she was doing something that mattered, but not everyone saw it that way. Whispers started, quiet at first, then louder. "She's getting awfully close to the grants, don't you think? I mean, first Christian gives her a job, and now she's always with Donald." Some people know how to play the long game. Pamela felt the shift in how some people looked at her, the side glances, the polite but distant nods. And one afternoon, she overheard what she wasn't meant to hear, a group of assistants near the break room. "Let's be honest. If it weren't for Donald, she wouldn't be here." "Exactly. She's just using him." Laughter. Pamela froze. Her stomach twisted. She turned away before they could see her, her hands clenched into fists. The words burned. She had never been the type to care about office gossip, but this was different. Because Donald was a child who trusted her, who came to her because he felt safe. And now, people were twisting that. That evening, Pamela sat in her office long after everyone had left, staring at the city lights through the window. A knock broke the silence. She turned to see Catherine standing in the doorway. "You heard them, didn't you?" Pamela forced a small laugh. "Is it that obvious?" Catherine stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "Office gossip is a disease," she said, "and you can either let it infect you or let it die on its own." Pamela sighed, rubbing her temples. I don't want them to think I'd ever use Donald like that. She hesitated. "He's important to me." Catherine nodded slowly, as if she had been waiting to hear those words. "I know that," she said, "and more importantly, he knows that. Nothing else matters." Pamela swallowed past the lump in her throat. It hurts." Catherine gave her a long, measured look. "Then let it hurt," she said simply. "But don't let it stop you." Pamela looked down at her desk, at the crayon drawings Donald had left behind, at the life she had started to build here. She wasn't here because of some game. She was here because she wanted to be. And she wasn't about to let small-minded people take that away from her. So she took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and let the whispers fade into the background. She had work to do. Pamela had learned to ignore the whispers. She told herself they didn't matter, that the only opinions worth considering were the ones that came from those who actually knew her. But deep down, she felt the weight of every skeptical glance, every dismissive smile, every careful conversation that ended the moment she walked into a room. And now, the doubt wasn't just lingering in hallways, it had followed her into the boardroom. Pamela sat at the long conference table, her hands resting on the notepad in front of her, though she had barely written a word. Across from her, a senior executive, Mr. Langston, cleared his throat, flipping through the proposal she had worked on for weeks. He skimmed it with little interest before setting it down, his fingers drumming against the table. "I just don't see how this is a good use of company resources," he said, looking up at Christian rather than addressing Pamela directly. Pamela's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "The initiative focuses on long-term community engagement," she said, keeping her tone even. "It's not just about donating money. We're building partnerships with schools, mentoring programs, and—" Langston cut her off with a thin smile. "That's all very noble, Ms. Carter," he said, "but you have to understand, our company is not a charity. We are a business. I fail to see how this benefits us." A murmur of agreement rippled through a few others at the table. Pamela felt her pulse quicken, but before she could respond, Christian leaned forward. "It benefits us," he said smoothly, "because a company's reputation is built on more than just profit margins." Langston shifted in his seat, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I don't disagree, but perhaps we should consider a more experienced hand overseeing these initiatives. Someone who understands corporate philanthropy." Pamela understood exactly what he was saying. She wasn't qualified. She didn't belong here. The words settled in her chest like a stone sinking in water. But before she could respond, Christian spoke again, this time with a sharpness that cut through the room. "Pamela has more first-hand experience with these communities than any of us sitting here," he said. "She understands the impact of these programs because she's lived it, and she's the one who built this proposal from the ground up." Langston's jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. Christian's gaze swept across the room. "If anyone here would like to take on the project themselves, be my guest. Otherwise, Pamela stays in charge." Silence. Langston glanced down at the file, his lips pressing together. "I suppose we can give it a trial run," he muttered. Pamela exhaled slowly, gripping her notepad a little tighter. A trial run. Not a full endorsement, not a victory, but not a dismissal either. She would take it. By the time she returned to her office, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving only exhaustion and lingering doubt. She had wanted to push back harder in that meeting, to defend herself the way Christian had defended her. But standing up to executives with years of experience and degrees from Ivy League schools wasn't easy. She still felt like a waitress in a high-rise office. But now, she had a job to do. She sat down, pulling out the proposal that had nearly been shut down. The community outreach program wasn't just a formality. It mattered. She thought about the shelters she had visited, the children who needed more than just temporary help. This wasn't just about proving herself anymore. It was about making real change. An unexpected visit. A knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Pamela expected to see Monica or Catherine, but instead it was Donald. He stepped inside, a familiar piece of paper in his hands, another drawing. Pamela smiled as he placed it on her desk. This one had something different. 3 figures instead of 2. Donald, herself, and Christian. She looked up at him. "What's this?" Donald grinned. "It's my team." Something about the simplicity of that statement made her throat tighten. She reached out, ruffling his hair lightly. "I think I got a promotion." Donald laughed before settling onto the couch, grabbing one of the spare notebooks she kept for him. As he flipped through the pages, Pamela glanced back at the proposal in front of her. It didn't matter if people questioned her place here. It didn't matter if they gave her trial runs instead of trust. She was here, and she was going to prove that she belonged, no matter how long it took. Pamela had spent weeks preparing for the fundraising gala. Every detail, from the guest list to the event layout, from the keynote speakers to the catering, had passed through her hands. She had lost count of the late nights she spent going over plans, making sure nothing was left to chance. And yet, as she stood at the entrance of the grand ballroom, Watching the guests arrive in sleek cars and tailored suits, doubt crept in like an old habit. This was the biggest responsibility she had taken on since joining the company. It wasn't just about organizing an event. It was about proving, once and for all, that she belonged here. The waitstaff moved seamlessly between guests, offering champagne and delicate appetizers. Soft music played in the background, a carefully curated blend of sophistication and warmth. Pamela had envisioned this moment 100 times, but now that it was happening, she felt like an outsider in her own success. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This was her night. As she moved through the crowd, checking on logistics, she noticed a group of children near the back of the ballroom. They sat at a special table reserved for the young beneficiaries of the evening's efforts, kids from local shelters, foster programs, and struggling schools. For a moment, she was just watching them, detached from the event, from the expectation pressing down on her. Then, her breath caught. She knew them. Not by name, not personally, but by the way they held themselves, by the way they hesitated before reaching for the food on their plates. Pamela had served these kids before. At Stars and Stripes Burger, she had seen them walk in, shoulders hunched, clothes a little too small, eyes darting around, as if waiting for someone to tell them they didn't belong. Some had come in with older siblings, some alone, scraping together a few dollars for a meal that had to last. They didn't remember her, but she remembered them. Her throat tightened as she watched one of the boys carefully tuck half of his bread roll into a napkin, the same way she had seen another child do years ago, probably saving it for later. This was why she had fought for this, not for corporate approval, not to silence the doubters, but for them. She forced herself to smile as she approached the table, enjoying everything. The kids looked up, hesitant at first, but then nodded. One of the girls, maybe 10 years old, tilted her head. "Are you the boss?" Pamela let out a soft laugh. "Something like that." "Do we have to say thank you to someone?" the girl asked. Pamela felt something ache inside her. "Number, just enjoy yourselves." The girl nodded before going back to her meal. Pamela stood there for a moment longer, taking in the weight of what she had built, what they had built. And just like that, the doubt faded. Later that evening, when the speeches had been given and the donations tallied, Pamela found herself standing on the rooftop terrace, letting the cool night air clear her mind. She heard footsteps behind her. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. "You did well tonight," Christian said, his voice even. Pamela exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "It wasn't just me. A lot of people helped make this happen. That's what makes a good leader." She finally turned to look at him. His expression was unreadable, as always, but there was something settled in his eyes, as if he had made a decision. "I have an offer for you," he said. Pamela straightened. "An offer?" Christian nodded. "The role of permanent charity project manager." She blinked. "You mean you've already been doing the job?" he said smoothly. "The title just makes it official." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. This wasn't a trial run. This wasn't temporary. This was real. Her first instinct was to hesitate, to ask if he was sure, if she was ready, if she was enough. But the words never left her mouth, because she knew the answer. Pamela nodded, a slow, steady motion that felt like stepping into the person she had been trying to become. "I'll take it," she said. Christian's lips curved slightly. "Good." She turned back toward the city skyline, feeling the weight of the moment settle around her. She had spent so much of her life proving herself. To employers who never saw her potential, to people who doubted her ability to rise above her circumstances, to herself. But tonight, she didn't need to prove anything anymore. She belonged. and for the first time in a long time, she believed it too. The scent of fresh-baked cake filled the grand estate, mingling with the sound of laughter and the occasional shriek of children running across the manicured lawn. Pamela stood at the edge of the terrace, taking it all in, the brightly colored balloons tied to the patio railing, the long table covered in gifts wrapped in cheerful paper, and, in the center of it all, Donald. It was his 8th birthday, and for once, he wasn't shy about being the center of attention. He dashed between guests, his energy boundless, his face beaming with excitement. Pamela had never been to a birthday party quite like this. She had expected something formal, maybe even stiff, a reflection of the world the Grants lived in. But the event was anything but. It was warm, welcoming, full of love, with friends and family gathered, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection for the little boy they had come to celebrate. A soft nudge at her side made her turn. Catherine stood beside her, a glass of champagne in hand, watching the scene with the quiet satisfaction of a mother who had done everything just right. "Enjoying yourself?" Catherine asked, amusement flickering in her eyes. Pamela let out a small laugh. "I don't think I've been to a party this big since... ever." Catherine chuckled. "Donald insisted you come. I don't think he would have forgiven me if you didn't." Pamela's gaze drifted back to the boy, who was now tearing through a pile of presents with eager hands. "He's something special." "He is," Catherine agreed. "But so are you." Pamela turned to her, surprised by the weight of those words. "You've given him something no one else has," Catherine continued. "A kind of trust, a kind of understanding. He knows you'll always be there for him, no matter what." Pamela swallowed past the sudden lump in her throat. Before she could respond, a small blur of motion barreled into her legs. Donald. "Pamela!" he gasped out of breath. "Did you see? I got a new soccer ball, and a telescope, and a—" He stopped, looking up at her with wide eyes. "Wait, you didn't get me a present, did you?" Pamela's heart stopped. She hadn't. Between work, the gala, and adjusting to her new life, she had completely forgotten. Donald's expression shifted, his brows knitting together in dramatic disappointment. "You mean, my favorite person in the world didn't get me anything?" Pamela panicked. He broke into a grin before she could finish. "I'm just kidding," he said, laughing. She let out a breath, shaking her head. "You little troublemaker." Donald giggled before grabbing her hand and tugging her toward the backyard. "Come on, we're playing soccer, and I need you on my team." Pamela cast a glance at Catherine, who simply raised an eyebrow in amusement. "Go," she said, "before he starts drafting you into something even more exhausting." Pamela laughed, allowing herself to be pulled toward the small, makeshift soccer field. A place to belong. The game was messy, filled with laughter and near collisions. Pamela wasn't particularly athletic, but Donald didn't care. He cheered every time she kicked the ball, even when it went nowhere near the goal. By the time the match ended in a dramatic, celebratory dog pile, Pamela was breathless with laughter, grass stains on her dress, and the happiest she had felt in a long time. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the estate, Pamela found herself leaning against the patio railing, taking it all in. Christian approached, hands in his pockets. "Not bad out there," he said, nodding toward the field. Pamela grinned. "I don't think I'll be going pro anytime soon." Christian smirked. "Donald seems to think otherwise." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching as Donald excitedly recounted his version of the game to one of his friends, embellishing the details wildly. Then Christian turned to her, his expression more serious. "You know, we don't just see you as an employee." Pamela stiffened, not sure how to respond. "You're part of this, Pamela," he continued. "Not just the work you do, but everything. You're family now." The words hit harder than she expected. She had spent so much of her life on the outside, looking in, working jobs where she was replaceable, navigating a world where she had no real safety net. And now, standing here, surrounded by people who cared, people who had taken her in without expectation or obligation, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. She swallowed past the emotion rising in her chest. "That means a lot," she said softly. Christian nodded, as if he understood. "It's the truth." Across the yard, Donald spotted her and broke into a run, heading straight toward her. Without hesitation, Pamela crouched down to meet him, bracing herself for the full impact of his hug. And in that moment, with Donald's arms wrapped around her and Catherine's knowing smile in the background, Pamela finally let herself believe it. She belonged, and she would never take that for granted. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining. See you there.